Chapter 20 and the Millennium. We're getting close to the end of this series. And we're looking at the end and what comes after. Just as a reminder, the complete text of all these units is available as a PDF on the website www.wilrens.org. And now a look at where we are in the book. This unit does not introduce a new series. It continues the previous one. We are right in the middle of the 7 judgment scenes in section number 6. And the section shows us how God deals with the forces and structure of evil in our world. Beginning with Babylon in chapter 18, continuing in chapter 19 with the 2 beasts and the kings of the earth, and now in chapter 20, shifting focus to the dragon. We are shown how Satan himself will be dealt with and cease to be a player for all eternity. There are some difficult theological questions that I need to talk about here. This is another difficult unit, and it's longer than average, even though it only covers 1 chapter. But one thing is not difficult here. At the beginning of chapter 20, we get to see how easy ultimate victory over Satan is. I'm sure you're familiar with action movies. Normally, such a movie finishes with a long scene in which the hero fights the scoundrel. It tends to be a life or death struggle. And even though we know that the hero will, of course, win, we still hold our breath at points where the hero is almost defeated and killed. The beginning of chapter 20 is the equivalent of such a scene, not just for the book of Revelation, but for the whole Bible. Yet there is no such long, drawn-out battle scene. God does not fight for his life with the dragon. In fact, he doesn't even get up from his throne. He delegates the task to an angel. The angel comes down with the chain, grabs the dragon, binds him, and locks him up. That's it. Okay, he's released for a little bit later, but only to be thoroughly defeated and then forever. So this is the easy part. Satan loses in the end. Now for the harder part. 2 things, so we are told in this chapter, are for 1,000 years. The binding of Satan and the reign of the martyrs, or perhaps of everyone who has not worshipped the beast. The wording is ambiguous. Is it martyrs only, or do all believers share in this reign? Because the word 1000 translates into Latin as mille, we often speak of the millennium, a period of 1,000 years. However, considering that numbers are consistently used symbolically in this book, it should be clear that the number 1000 is probably not used literally, but stands for a very long time period. 10 times 10 times 10, the number of completion multiplied with itself. And as such, it forms a strong contrast to the little while of Satan's release in 20 verse 3, and to the 1260 days, or 3.5 years, of the beast earlier in the book. It's also the counterpart to the 3.5 days that the 2 witnesses are dead before they ascend into heaven. And chapter 20 shows what awaits them there. The martyrs only suffer for a short time, and as a reward for their suffering, they reign with Christ for a very long time. It's contrast. Notice that in verse 4, John sees the souls of those who had been beheaded. These are the same souls he'd seen earlier in 6 verse 9, where they were under the altar. Revelation 20 serves as a promise to those who lose their life for their faith. They will share in Christ's rule. From an earthly perspective, it appears that they lose. From a heavenly perspective, they gain a lot. That much is clear, but beyond this, it gets controversial. How do we understand the millennium? What is it, and where does it fit chronologically? Traditionally, the millennium in Revelation 20 has been understood in 3 different ways, each leading to a different scheme or scenario for the end times, and each named after the millennium. They are called premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism, and they differ in when they expect Christ to return, either before the millennium, that's premillennialism, pre means before, or after the millennium, postmillennialism, post meaning after, and they differ in whether they understand the millennium as a separate, still future era, or as a symbolic representation of a present reality. And the latter is amillennialism, from a meaning non, no separate future era. There is a fourth view, really a variant of premillennialism, which is quite different from its parent. It's also highly influential among evangelicals, even among those who have never heard its name, and I will therefore include it in this overview as well. It is called dispensational premillennialism, or simply dispensationalism. Before I give a brief explanation of each of these four views, I should reiterate a crucial point. Revelation is not chronological. Now, of course, the vision that John saw has a clear sequence with one scene happening after another, also in chapter 19, verse 20, as shown here. There's the white horse, the battle, the binding of Satan, the millennium, the 1,000 years, and then the battle. But the order of the visions is not necessarily the order in which things happen in real life. In fact, there is, as we've seen, significant recapitulation in the book. We've often noticed that John goes back to an earlier point in time to once again show or cover some of the same ground from a different perspective. Therefore, we cannot simply assume that the scenes in chapter 19 and 20 foretell a series of events that form a linear chronological sequence. First, premillennialism. It believes that Revelation 19, verse 11 through 21 describes the second coming of Christ. It will be followed by a millennial kingdom on earth, during which Satan is bound and Jesus reigns, presumably from Jerusalem. It will therefore be an era marked by peace and prosperity. Premillennialism then argues that the sequence in chapter 19 and 20 is indeed chronological. The millennium follows the second coming. In the end, Satan is released for a short while and a second final battle takes place, in which he is soundly defeated again, this time forever. In premillennialism, there's also a second resurrection of the dead. First is believers at the second coming, and the second of all people after the millennium. And there is a second last judgment at the beginning and at the end of the millennium, and a second intermediate age, a second not yet, that of the millennium. Critics of premillennialism point out that this is not what we find in the rest of the New Testament. There appears to be only one general resurrection of all the dead at the second coming, followed by the last judgment, not by yet another intermediate period. Nothing in the preceding 65 books of the Bible and the preceding 19 chapters of Revelation has prepared us to expect a millennial age after the second coming. So, the critics of premillennialism. Then, dispensationalism. As I said, it's a form of premillennialism. It first emerged around 1830 in the writings and teachings of John Nelson Darby, and it's far more complex than historic premillennialism. It adds a lot of stuff. For one, Darby proposed a secret rapture 7 years before the visible return of Christ, and went into great detail as to what would happen during those years. The events that take place include all the plagues and judgments described in the book of Revelation. So, in other words, dispensationalism works with a strongly futurist interpretation of Revelation. It's all still to happen. This is the stuff most popular end-time books are made of. They tend to be quite speculative. and have often offered predictions that then did not come true. Dispensationalism also makes Revelation largely irrelevant for today's Christian readers, because they will supposedly be raptured before it starts happening, but also for the first readers, because they died long before any of it was to happen, and indeed for all generations in between as well. I find this the least convincing interpretation of the book. Third, postmillennialism. It believes that the second coming follows a long era of great peace and prosperity on earth, a golden age of humanity, or in other words, a millennium, although postmillennialists don't always call it a millennium. This age comes about as the gospel is preached to more and more nations, transforming them in the process, and in this gradual way, the yeast of the kingdom is doing its work. The parables of the kingdom, the mustard seed grows to be a mighty tree, the stone rolling down, overthrowing the statue in Daniel's dream, Daniel 2, becomes a mighty mountain, filling the whole earth, also suggesting something gradual. Now, this golden age will not be a perfect world, but will demonstrate within history the power and the wisdom of the gospel. God does not win by the exercise of raw force at the very end, imposing his will on a resisting creation or humanity, but he wins by transforming human history through truth and love from within. Now, there's probably some truth to this. After all, Christianity has brought significant improvements wherever it was adopted, but the critics of postmillennialism suspect it is overly optimistic and expects too much. Evil continues to be a real presence in our world as well. And then last, amillennialism. It understands the millennium as a symbol expressing something about the present age, not about a separate, still future era in salvation history. This reign does not take place on earth, but in and from heaven. After all, where are the thrones mentioned in 20 verse 4? And where are the souls of the martyrs? Most thrones in this book are located in heaven. Nothing in chapter 20 suggests that this reign takes place in and from Jerusalem, on earth. Quite possibly then we are to think of Christ's present reign from heaven, in which believers who have died share. Critics of amillennialism ask what it means that Satan is bound. Looking at the world might leave one with the impression that Satan is not bound at all. Amillennialists answer that Satan is bound in a relative, not an absolute sense. They point to passages like Colossians 2 verse 15, which claims that God disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in Christ. Amillennialists understand this to make the same point in different words. And according to Matthew 12 verse 29, Jesus bound the strong man. In Revelation 20 verse 3, the book makes clear in which sense Satan is bound. He is no longer able to deceive the nations. He cannot prevent the spread of the gospel. Many amillennialists see this binding as a parallel to chapter 12. In their view, it's a flashback or another example of recapitulation in the book. In 20 verse 1, so they say, John takes us back to a much earlier point. The binding of Satan, in that case, is what Christ accomplished on the cross. This would also explain why the final battle is repeated. It's not because it happens twice, it's simply described twice. First in chapter 19 and then again in chapter 20, verse 7 through 10. It is also possible to think of the battle and the binding of Satan as a cycle or pattern in history, as something that repeats itself. This is based on a different understanding of the phrase not deceive the nations any longer in 20 verse 3. Revelation 20 verse 8 and 9 show what this phrase means, what happens when Satan deceives the nations. They gather for war and attack the camp of the saints. To deceive the nations, then, is to entice them to an all-out attack on the people of God. The climax of the battle takes place whenever human ideology and state power devote their considerable resources to eradicating the church. This is parallel to the way Pilate, Caiaphas and Herod conspired against Jesus. It's what the Roman Empire sought to do in the 2nd and 3rd century. What followed was a very long time, a millennium, of relative peace for the church, enabling it to firmly establish itself in Europe and from there in the rest of the world. The Roman Empire failed in its attempt to destroy the church. Other governments and ideologies have tried since. In the end, the church survives, the ideology lies in ruins, and Satan's power is reduced. And in this way, the battle takes place throughout history, not only at the end. Either way, whether the binding took place at the cross or whether it is a repeated and perhaps progressive and cumulative event within the course of history, in amillennialism it makes sense to claim that the millennium is now. It's a present reality because Satan's power has been greatly reduced. And in the end, Satan is conquered completely and for all eternity. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, in this war, the Lamb conquers the dragon, not the other way around. So stand firm, we are on the winning side. Two more things in this unit. A word on the first resurrection and on the beginning of chapter 21. John speaks of the first resurrection and of the second death, but he never mentions the second resurrection or the first death. Now, the second death is defined as the lake of fire. It's permanent and spiritual death or destruction. By implication, the first death would be physical or natural death. First and second, therefore, do not simply rank the order of things that are essentially alike. The first and second death are not alike at all. There's an essential and qualitative difference. So why would the first and second resurrection both be literal and both point to a physical bodily resurrection, as if this out-of-the-ordinary event is to happen not just once, but twice? An important key is given in 20 verse 6. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power. Well, this shows that the first resurrection is much more than merely coming back to life. It protects from the second death. As we'll see later in the chapter, the second resurrection does not. The first resurrection, therefore, must be spiritual, not literal, and only the second resurrection is literal or physical resurrection. But if so, what is it? Over the centuries, interpreters who understand the first resurrection as such, as non-literal, have given three different explanations for this concept of a first resurrection. The church father Augustine believed it was regeneration. We experience the first resurrection when we are born again. In this case, Revelation 20, verse 4 to 6, describes something that is true for all believers, even those still on earth. There is support for this in John 5, which indeed implies a double resurrection. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, now, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Same verb is used as in Revelation 20, they will come to life, something that was already happening in the ministry of Jesus. And then a little later in this passage, do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear, future tense, his voice and come out. This refers to a future and literal or bodily resurrection. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. So this would be the second literal resurrection. Others believe it means we share in the resurrection of Christ. After all, this is what Ephesians tells us. God raised us up with him, that's the first resurrection, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. That is, he seated us on the thrones in heaven that we read about in Revelation 20. Yet a third option is that Revelation 20 describes what happens at death. Believers come to life in heaven and find themselves in the presence of Christ. In other words, it describes the transition into the afterlife, the intermediate state between death and resurrection. Literally, the text speaks of beheaded souls coming to life. This is highly peculiar language. It's not used elsewhere to speak of physical resurrection. And quite possibly all three ideas are in view, seeing that all three ideas do find support elsewhere in the Bible and are different aspects of new life. A detailed look at the concept of a first resurrection, therefore, appears to support the amillennial interpretation of Revelation 20. As for the beginning of chapter 21, well, the chapter division is really unfortunate here. The first 8 verses of chapter 21 are really the concluding part of chapters 19 and 20, not the beginning of John's final vision. It is scene number 7. Revelation 21 verse 9 makes for a strong structural marker that indicates the break between the two sections. The final scene in verse 1 through 8 does something that's done more often in the book. Toward the end of a section, John introduces what will be the subject of the next section. He did this, for instance, with Babylon in 16 verse 9. And so here he introduces the city that is also a bride, and that will be the main topic of the concluding section. Following the defeat of evil in God's good creation, we will now get to see what his true design and intention for human life looks like.